When a young girl suffers in silence, enduring unspeakable abuse in what should have been her safe haven, her adopted father believes his dark secrets will remain hidden. But he's dead wrong as the truth begins to unravel. It exposes a web of lies and cruelty that will send shockwaves through her family and their community. This is a story of innocence, stolen resilience, revealed, and a relentless pursuit of justice for a life cut tragically short. Before we dive into this story, let us know where you're watching from. And if you believe in standing up for the vulnerable, be sure to like and subscribe for more. The evening was deceptively quiet on a tree-lined street in a wealthy neighborhood when the 911 call came, and a frantic female voice had screamed for help before abruptly hanging up, leaving dispatchers scrambling to send both paramedics and law enforcement. Within minutes, the wail of sirens shattered the sea as a police cruiser and ambulance pulled up to the address, a stately apartment building that belled the horrors within. Detectives on the scene, led by Detective Nathan Hart and his partner Detective Isabel Moreno, were greeted by chaos as they entered the spacious penthouse apartment. A young girl no older than 6 lay unconscious on the living room floor. Her tiny body was covered in bruises and her head was swollen with a deep gash oozing blood. Paramedics rushed past the detectives, swiftly assessing the child's condition. "We need to move now," one shouted, stabilizing her fragile frame before wheeling her out on a stretcher. As the paramedics worked, Hart scanned the room, her experienced eye noting the stark contrast between luxury and disorder. Expensive furniture was shoved askew, a vase lay shattered in the corner, and an overturned coffee table was smeared with what appeared to be blood. Scattered amidst the chaos were syringes, a spoon with burn marks, and empty bottles of prescription pills, grim evidence of drug abuse. Near the girl's lifeless form stood her adoptive father, Joseph Harper, a tall man in his late 40s with an air of detachment that immediately raised Moreno's suspicion. His suit jacket hung carelessly off one arm, and his tie was loosened, as though he had been in the middle of some mundane task. When chaos erupted, his face showed no sign of concern, only mild irritation. As he addressed the officers, "She fell," he said flatly, waving a hand toward the child, as though dismissing her condition. "Kids climb on furniture. It happens." Moreno's sharp gaze landed on him, her instincts immediately on high alert. "That's a hell of a fa to leave injuries like that," she said, her voice laced with skepticism. "Where exactly did this happen?" Joseph gestured vaguely toward the staircase over there. "I don't know. I wasn't in the room." Across the room, a woman sat huddled on the couch, her disheveled appearance a stark contrast to the apartment's otherwise pristine aesthetic. She was a striking woman in her early 30s, though her current state rendered her unrecognizable. Her left eye was swollen shut, her lip was split, and her arms bore fresh bruises. She rocked back and forth, slightly cradling her elbows, her eyes darting nervously between Joseph and the detectives. Hart exchanged a look with Moreno before approaching her gently. "Ma'am, can you tell us your name?" Hart asked, crouching down to meet her eye level. The woman hesitated, flinching slightly as she glanced toward Joseph. Her lips trembled, but she finally whispered, "Elena." Moreno gave a small, reassuring nod. "Elena, can you tell us what happened here?" Elena flinched again, her hands trembling as she pulled a blanket tighter around her. She fell," she mumbled, not meeting Moreno's eyes. Her voice was barely audible, the words rehearsed and hollow. Hart exchanged another look with Moreno, who stood near the kitchen counter examining more paraphernalia. Something was deeply wrong here, but proving it would take more than gut feelings. "We'll come back to that," Hart said softly, rising to his feet as the paramedics wheeled Lila toward the waiting ambulance. A neighbor appeared in the hallway, drawn by the commotion. She was a middle-aged woman, clutching a small dog, her face pale. As she approached the officers, "Is she okay?" the woman asked, her voice shaking. "The little girl, we're not sure yet," Hart replied carefully. "Did you see or hear anything tonight?" The woman hesitated, glancing nervously at Joseph, who now leaned casually against the doorframe, watching the scene unfold with an unnerving calm. "I heard yelling earlier," the neighbor finally said, lowering her voice, as though afraid of being overheard. "The man and the woman, they argue a lot, but tonight I heard a child scream. It was awful." Her words sent a chill through Hart. "What time was this?" he asked, his notepad ready. "Maybe an hour ago. I thought about calling someone, but I didn't know if it was my place," the woman said, wringing her hands. "I'm so sorry. I should have done something. Moreno nodded, his jaw tightening. You're doing something now, thank you. She handed the woman her card and instructed her to stay available for further questioning. As the ambulance sped away with La, Moreno turned her attention back to the apartment. Hart had been cataloging items and now approached with an evidence bag containing a bloody shirt. This was stuffed under the couch cushions. He said grimly, looks like the kids. Moreno's eyes narrowed as she approached Joseph, who remained infuriatingly calm. We're going to need you both to come down to the precinct for further questioning, she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. Joseph raised an eyebrow. Is that necessary? I've told you what happened. She fell. Moreno stepped closer, her eyes boring into his. And I don't buy it for a second. Joseph's smirk faded slightly, but he didn't protest further. Elena, meanwhile, began to visibly shake, her eyes darting to Joseph. Before lowering to the floor, Moreno approached her, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. Elena, we just need to ask you a few questions, he said. You'll be safe. The word safe seemed to jolt Elena. For the first time, her eyes flicked up to Moreno, wide and brimming with fear. But before she could speak, Joseph stepped in front of her, his voice cold and commanding. We'll answer your questions at the station, he said. She's not in a state to talk right now. Hart stared him down, her instincts screaming that there was far more to this man than met the eye. We'll see about that, he said, curtly, motioning for Moreno to escort Elena outside. As the police vehicles pulled away from the apartment building, Hart replayed the scene in her mind. The disarray, the drugs, the terrified woman, and the lifeless child. All signs pointed to something far darker than an accidental fall. And then there was Joseph Harper, whose cold indifference chilled him to the core. Just as she was about to radio for an update on Lila's condition, her phone buzzed. It was the hospital. She braced herself as she answered. The voice on the other end was grim. Detective Moreno, we stabilize her for now, but the injuries are severe. You need to know they're consistent with blunt force trauma. Moreno's grip tightened on her phone. She didn't respond immediately, instead staring out the window as the city lights blurred past. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and determined. We're going to get to the bottom of this. As she hung up, the car fell into a heavy silence. Both she and Hart knew the investigation was only just beginning, but the picture was already growing darker. What do you think? Was Joseph Harper lying about the fall? Or could there be even darker secrets he's hiding? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video if you believe Lila deserves justice at the precinct. Detectives Hart and Moreno prepped for what they knew would be a challenging set of interrogations. Seated in separate interview rooms were Joseph Harper. Everywhere broken furniture that doesn't scream safe home to me. Joseph's jaw tightened. Elena is the one who can't keep herself together. I try to keep things clean, but she's a mess. Maybe you should be asking her more questions. We are. Hart countered, his voice rising slightly. But right now we're asking you, where were you when Lila supposedly fell? I was in the kitchen, Joseph replied smoothly. I didn't see it happen. Hart pressed further. And you didn't hear her fall? Didn't hear her cry out? Joseph hesitated, his composure faltering. I don't know, maybe I did. It all happened so fast. Meanwhile, forensic reports began trickling and Moreno stepped out to review them. While Hart continued the interrogation, the findings were frustratingly inconclusive. No fingerprints on any potential weapon, no blood evidence suggesting foul play. The bruises on Lila's body were extensive, but could not definitively be tied to Joseph or Elena. As Moreno re-entered, she whispered to Hart, the forensics aren't giving us much, we need something more. Hart nodded, his patience wearing thin. Turning back to Joseph, he asked bluntly, do you use drugs, Joseph? Because that apartment looked like a den, not a home. Joseph's eyes narrowed. I don't touch that stuff. Maybe Elena does, but that's not my business. It is your business, Moreno interjected, her voice firm. If you're responsible for a child in that environment, then it's absolutely your business. Joseph smirked, crossing his arms. Like I said, this is all just a big misunderstanding. The detectives regrouped, stepping outside to discuss their next move. He's stonewalling, Hart muttered. And Elena's too scared to open up. What about the neighbors? Moreno suggested. Maybe they saw or heard something we can use later. That day, the detectives canvassed the building, speaking with residents. Most neighbors reported hearing arguments from the apartment over the past few months, but admitted they hadn't seen any clear signs of physical abuse. One elderly tenant hesitated before adding, I heard screaming last night. A child screams. And then silence. Did you see anyone go in or out of the apartment? REO asked the neighbor. Shook her head no, but it was loud like something broke. Armed with this information, the detectives returned to the precinct, hoping it might pressure Elena to open up before they could bring her back into the interrogation room. Their phones buzzed with an alert from the hospital. Laya's condition had worsened. They rushed to the hospital where Dar Bennett met them in the hallway, her face grim. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "Layla's injuries are too severe. We're doing everything we can, but it's not looking good." The weight of her words hung heavy in the air. Moreno clenched her fists, anger simmering beneath her professional exterior. "We need more," she said, turning to Hart. "Something to break this case wide open." Hart nodded grimly. "We're running out of time." The detectives left the hospital with a renewed sense of urgency, determined to uncover the truth before it was too late. The air at the precinct was thick with tension as detectives Hart and Moreno reviewed the latest update from the hospital. The message was clear. Layla Harper, the 6-year-old girl who had been rushed to the ER with life-threatening injuries, had succumbed to her trauma. Despite the best efforts of the medical team, her young body couldn't withstand the damage. The grim news sent ripples through the station. This was no longer a case of suspected abuse. It was a homicide. Moreno broke the silence. "We're not just racing against the clock now. This case is going to blow up in the media the second word gets out." Hart nodded, his jaw clenched. "Then let's make sure we're ready when it does." We dig deeper into Harper's background. "I want everything: his job history, financials, personal connections. Someone like him doesn't just snap out of nowhere." The next morning, the story was splashed across every major news outlet. The Angel in the Shadows. They called her a nickname born from an anonymous nurse who had commented on her delicate bruised face. Photos of Law, her golden curls and bright smile, likely taken during better times, were everywhere. Public outrage was instantaneous. Vigils sprang up near the hospital with candles and stuffed animals lining the sidewalks. Social media erupted with demands for justice, while the police department faced mounting pressure to deliver answers. Back at the precinct, the detectives split their focus. Morrow delved into Joseph Harper's history, uncovering threads that painted a troubling picture. A series of domestic abuse allegations had been filed against him over the years, dating back to his early 20s. Most had been dismissed either for lack of evidence or after the victims mysteriously recanted their statements. Hart walked into Moreno's office holding a stack of reports. "This guy's got a trail of complaints as long as my arm," he said, tossing the files onto her desk. "It's like every woman he's been with has tried to call for help only to end up silenced." Moreno scanned the documents, her brow furrowed. "And now we've got another one." Meanwhile, Elena Cole had been escorted back to the precinct for further questioning. This time, she appeared even more fragile. Her eyes darted nervously toward the door, as though expecting Joseph to burst in at any moment. Moreno led the interrogation, keeping her tone as gentle as possible, while still pressing for answers. "Elena," she began, leaning forward slightly, "we know this is hard for you, but you have to tell us the truth. If you stay silent, we can't help you. And we can't help La." At the mention of Laya's name, Elena's lower lip quivered, tears welled in her eyes, and for a moment Moreno thought she might break. But then, just as quickly, Elena clammed up again. "Joseph's lawyer said I shouldn't talk," she whispered, barely audible. Hart stepped in, his tone firm but not harsh. "Joseph's lawyer isn't here right now, Elena. You are. And you know what happened in that apartment. You're the only one who can give Layla justice." Elena's hands fidgeted in her lap. "Finally," she muttered, "he didn't mean to hurt her. He just gets so mad sometimes." She spilled her drink, and he lost it. The detectives exchanged a glance. It was the first direct admission of Joseph's involvement, but they knew it wouldn't hold up in court without more to back it up. Hart pressed gently. "Elena, what do you mean by he lost it? Did you see him hit her?" She hesitated, wringing her hands. I don't know. I think so, but I was scared. I went into the other room." Moreno leaned in. "You have to be honest with us, Elena. If you're scared of him, we can protect you, but you need to tell us everything." Elena froze, her gaze darting between the detectives. "I can't," she finally whispered. "You don't know what he's like." Her statement was maddeningly vague, but it spoke volumes. The detectives left the interrogation room frustrated, but determined that woman is terrified of him, Moreno said as they walked towards the bullpen. "And not just for herself. He's got her so wrapped up in fear, she can't even defend a dead child." Hart nodded grimly. We need a break and fast. That break came unexpectedly later that afternoon. Forensic investigators had returned to the Harper apartment to comb through it one last time in the chaos of their initial sweep. Some items had been overlooked. One of those items was a small, inconspicuous safe tucked behind a stack of books in the master bedroom closet. Detective Hart was on the phone with the forensic lead. When the discovery was made a safe, he repeated, his tone sharpening. "Can you open it? We're working on it now," the lead replied. "It looks like it hasn't been touched in years." Within an hour, the safe was cracked open. Inside, the team found an assortment of documents, including unfiled adoption papers for Layla Harper. Moreno stared at the scanned copies that had been emailed to her desk. "Unfiled," she repeated aloud. "What the hell does that mean?" Hart leaned over her shoulder, his brow furrowing. "It means something about this adoption wasn't on the level." As the detectives pieced through the revelations of the day, a troubling new layer of the case began to emerge. Joseph Harper wasn't just a man with a history of violence. He was a man with secrets. And as they stared at the papers spread across Moreno's desk, it became clear that this case was about to take a much darker turn. The discovery of the unfiled adoption documents sent shockwaves through the investigation. The papers, yellowed and creased with age, bore no official seals or state approvals, just Joseph Harper's signature, alongside a witness signature that detectives quickly identified as fake. It was the break Hart and Moreno had been waiting for, but it opened a door to a far more convoluted and sinister case than they had anticipated. "Unfiled adoption documents," Moreno said, her voice tinged with disbelief, as she paced their office. "That explains why nothing showed up in social services records. Law wasn't legally." His daughter Hart leaned against the edge of his desk, arms crossed. "Which means we're not just dealing with child abuse and homicide. We've got fraud, trafficking, and who knows what else." Moreno's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, and then at Hart. "Forensics just traced a name from the documents. Megan Lewis. She's listed as Lila's biological mother." "Megan Lewis," Hart repeated, scribbling the name into his notebook. "Let's bring her in." An hour later, Megan Lewis arrived at the precinct, her apprehension evident in the way she clutched her bag. She was a young woman in her late 20s, her features tired and worn. Her hands trembled slightly as she sat across from the detectives in the interview room. "Miss Lewis," Moreno began, gently sliding a copy of the adoption documents across the table, "we need your help to understand what happened here. Did you know Joseph Harper?" Megan's eyes locked onto the papers, her face paled, and her voice wavered. I knew him years ago. He said he was helping families adopt children." "Why are you asking about this now?" Moreno's tone softened. "The child in question, Layla Harper, has been hurt. We need to know how she ended up with Joseph." Megan froze, the color draining from her cheeks. "Hurt? What do you mean?" Hart leaned forward, his voice steady but firm. "Megan Law was hospitalized with severe injuries. She passed away yesterday." Megan's reaction was immediate. Her hands flew to her face, muffling a horrified gasp. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she rocked slightly in her seat. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. No, that's not possible." He said she'd be safe, he promised." Hart and Moreno exchanged a glance. Hart pressed gently. "Who promised?" "Megan. Was it Joseph?" Megan nodded, her voice trembling. "Yes, I was 19. I just left home, and I had nothing. I found out I was pregnant, and I panicked. He told me he could help. He said he worked with families who couldn't have kids and wanted to adopt." He seemed kind. Moreno's expression softened, but her tone remained focused. "What happened next?" Megan swallowed hard, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "He gave me papers to sign. He said they were for the adoption process, that my baby would go to a good home. I didn't know anything about the law or how adoptions worked. I just wanted her to have a chance at a better life." Moreno frowned. "Did he mention who the family was? Did you ever meet them?" "No," Megan said, shaking her head. "He told me it was a private arrangement and that the family didn't want to be involved until everything was finalized. I believed him." Hart leaned back, his expression dark. "Megan, those papers weren't legal. Law never went to another family. Joseph kept her himself." The of his words seemed to crush Megan. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. After a few moments, she looked up, her face streaked with tears. "Why would he do that? Why would he lie? That's what we're trying to figure out," Hart said. "But we need your help." "Did he ever ask for money or mention other children?" Megan furrowed her brow, thinking back. He asked for a fee, said it was for legal costs and paperwork. I gave him everything I had, but it wasn't much as for other children. He mentioned helping a few families before me, but I didn't ask questions. Moreno pressed gently. Do you remember how much you gave him? A little over $1,000. Megan replied, her voice small. Hart jotted the number in his notebook, his mind racing. This wasn't just a one-time deal, he muttered to Moreno. This guy might have a whole operation. The detectives escorted me out of the station, assuring her they would keep her informed as the case progressed. As soon as she was gone, Hart turned to Moreno. If he's done this before, there has to be a trail. Financial records, payments, something. Let's see what forensics can dig up. Later that evening, the detectives brought Elena back in for questioning. Armed with the new information, she sat across from them, her demeanor as fragile as ever. Elena Moreno began. We know about the adoption law. Wasn't legally Joseph's daughter. Elena's head shot up, her eyes wide. What? No, that's not true. He told me everything was taken care of. It wasn't, Hart said firmly, and we need to know if you were involved in any of it. I didn't know, Elena cried, her voice trembling. I swear I thought it was all real. Joseph handled everything. He always said I didn't need to worry about the details. Moreno leaned forward, her tone sharp but not unkind. Elena, if Joseph lied about the adoption, what else is he hiding? You need to start being honest with us. For Laya's sake. Elena hesitated, her gaze darting to the door, as though Joseph might storm in at any moment. Finally, she took a shaky breath and whispered. He hurt her. He hurt Law a lot. I wanted to stop him, but I couldn't. He said if I ever told anyone, I'd be next. Hart's jaw tightened, and Moreno's expression hardened. The revelation, though not entirely unexpected, landed like a gut punch. Elena, Moreno said softly, you need to tell us everything if you want to help La. This is your chance. Elena broke down, her sobs filling the room. I didn't do anything to protect her, she choked out. I let him hurt her. I was too scared. Hart's voice was firm but steady. Elena, we can't change what happened, but we can make sure he pays for it. Will you help us? She nodded through her tears, her voice barely audible. Yes. The detectives left the room, the weight of the case pressing heavily on their shoulders. As they prepared to take Elena's full statement, Moreno turned to Hart. This isn't just a broken home. This is a broken system, and we're only scratching the surface. Detectives Hart and Moreno sat across from Joseph Harper in the interrogation room. The unfiled adoption documents spread out on the table. The once unflappable Joseph shifted slightly in his chair, his fingers drumming a rhythm on the metal surface. His calm, collected demeanor remained intact, but the tension in his jaw betrayed him. These documents tell a very different story than the one you've been giving us. Joseph Hart began, his voice steady but firm. Layla's adoption was never finalized. In fact, it was never legal. Joseph smirked, leaning back in his chair. So what are you saying? It's a crime to take in a child who needed a home. Megan knew exactly what she was doing when she gave La to me. Gave her to you, Moreno interjected, her tone sharp. That's not how adoption works. And you know it. Megan trusted you to follow through on a legal process, not forge papers, and keep the child for yourself. Joseph shrugged. Megan was in no position to care for a kid she didn't want her. She practically begged me to take her. What was I supposed to do? Let her grow up in foster care? Hart slammed his hand on the table, causing Joseph to flinch slightly. Don't try to spin this like you're some kind of savior. You manipulated a vulnerable young woman and exploited the system to serve your own twisted needs. And now Lila is dead because of you. Joseph's expression hardened. I didn't kill her. You don't have anything tying me to her injuries. Moreno leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. You're right for now, but let's talk about what we do have. Drug paraphernalia littering the apartment, witnesses hearing screams, and now a paper trail of illegal activity that points directly to you. You're running out of places to hide. Joseph's lawyer, a middle-aged man with a slick demeanor, knocked on the glass and gestured to interrupt. This conversation is over, he announced as he entered the room. Detectives, you're clearly trying to railroad my client without sufficient evidence. Any further questioning will be considered harassment. Hart and Moreno exchanged a look before stepping outside. That evening, Hart and Moreno convened with the forensic team to review Joseph's financial records. A tense silence filled the room as the lead forensic analyst, Kim, scrolled through highlighted transactions. Here's what we found, Kim began, pointing to several flagged payments. Joseph made a series of cash deposits over the past 5 years, all of them corresponded times when children were placed in private adoptions. Private adoptions? Hart asked, his brow furrowing. Unofficial. Kim clarified, there's no legal documentation for these kids. Just like Lila. But the pattern's consistent. He was profiting off these arrangements. Moreno's jaw tightened. So we're looking at more than just one child. How many? From what we've pieced together, so far at least 2 others, Kim said. But it's possible there are more. We'll need time to dig deeper. Hart exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. This just keeps getting worse. He wasn't just a bad parent. He was running an operation. As the detectives processed the new information, Moreno's phone buzzed. It was a message from a social worker who had been reviewing Lila's case file. Joseph's lawyer is trying to block access to all records, Moreno said, reading the text aloud. He's claiming it violates client privilege. Hart's expression darkened. We need to get ahead of this. If he's trying to cover his tracks, it means that we're onto something big. Detectives Hart and Moreno sat in the pre-conference room, where stacks of documents, photos, and evidence filled the table. The case had taken on a sprawling life of its own, and every new discovery seemed to uncover a deeper layer of deception. That afternoon, their efforts took a pivotal turn when a young man named Evan stepped into the room clad in a wrinkled button-down shirt and clutching a file folder. He introduced himself as a former paralegal from Joseph Harper previous law firm. I don't know if this will help, but I couldn't stay silent anymore. Evan began, his voice wavering. Hart motioned for him to sit down. Start from the beginning.